In the first two parts of this series, we dealt generally with the topic of leadership, what it is, why it fails, and how to implement a model of leadership development that addresses some of the causes of that failure. In this, our third and final part, we will look at the idea of organizational culture and how it affects performance and the development of leadership in your practice. For many veterinary practices, organizational culture may be a topic that has never warranted much consideration. However, within the business world, it has long been recognized as a significant factor in how an organization performs. Two Harvard business professors, Cotter and Heskett, conducted an 11-year study of 32 major firms and published their work in 1992 in a book titled Corporate Culture and Performance. They discovered two general types of culture and outlined their impact on organizational performance. The first type of culture they labeled defensive and defined it as a culture that undermines economic performance by preventing the organization from identifying and implementing strategies and tactics that are needed to compete in an increasingly competitive world. The second type of culture they noticed was labeled constructive and defined as a culture that encourages employees to work to their fullest potential, resulting in high levels of motivation, satisfaction, teamwork, customer service, sales growth, and superior long-term financial performance. What is most telling is the contrast between the two cultures in terms of overall performance. Cotter and Heskett measured that performance in terms of percentage of growth over time in three different categories: revenue, stock price, and net income. The results are startling. These numbers tell us what many of us already intuitively understand. In a work environment where people are motivated, satisfied, and challenged to improve, performance is significantly better than in those environments where people are frustrated, discouraged, and distracted from their work by interpersonal tensions. What may not be so obvious is just how significant the difference really is. As one can see from the research, the organizations that operated with a constructive culture produced more than 4 times the revenue of those with defensive cultures. And even more significant is that they did so with almost half the cost, or an 8-fold difference in net income. So what does this practically mean to your practice and its performance? What can you do about it? Can you really reshape your practice's culture? And if so, how? Well, we certainly cannot deal with all that those questions entail in this brief video segment, but we can introduce some ideas that will help you to understand culture better and how you might have an impact on how your practice performs. First, let's define culture as follows. Culture is shared learning acquired over time that shapes assumptions and gives rise to basic patterns of behavior exhibited by members of a group or organization. An important element of this definition to notice is that culture shapes assumptions. These are not mere opinions, but rather more deeply held ideas of the way things are or the way things work. Whereas opinions are usually conscious and changeable, assumptions are more deeply held, subconscious ideas that are more stable and more widely held than opinions. For example, what kind of decorations should we put on the walls? Who's the employee of the month? And what are we going to have for lunch at the next staff meeting are all matters of opinion. The answers to these questions will probably vary from week to week and even from person to person. On the other hand, how should we dress? Is it okay to show up late for work? What happens when someone makes a mistake that costs the practice money? Are questions that probably have much more uniform answers that won't vary significantly over time. It is important to understand and be aware of assumptions because of their relationship to and impact upon performance. Without a fundamental change in underlying assumptions, long-term changes in performance cannot and will not occur. It might be thought of like this. In order to obtain a particular result, people must demonstrate certain behaviors. In turn, those behaviors are based upon fundamental assumptions. In order to change outcomes, leaders and managers must look beyond behaviors to the underlying assumptions that drive those behaviors. If assumptions remain unchanged, people will inevitably revert to old patterns of behavior with no significant change in results. For example, in order to discover a new world, Christopher Columbus had to be willing to sail beyond view of the shoreline. However, in order to do that, he first had to confront and change his own fundamental assumption, and the assumptions of many others, that the world was flat. As you can probably already imagine, such fundamental change can be difficult, and leadership is a critical ingredient in the process. Consider this graphic. As you can see, leaders have an impact on culture by putting forward new ideas or decisions that produce different results, which when successful are adopted by others, leading to new assumptions and changes in behavior. It's important to realize that the new ideas must be viewed as successful by others, or in other words, it must lead to desirable outcomes or rewards in order to lead to sustainable change. Think about what would have happened if Columbus had not discovered the Americas. His efforts would have been viewed as a failure and only reinforced currently held assumptions that the world was indeed flat, and one shouldn't go sailing too far or you will fall off the edge of the world. So let's take a look at some practical steps to take in order to effect change. You will notice the connection between these steps and the elements of the results-based leadership development model that we introduced in our previous sessions. Number 1, identify desired performance and define it in terms of outcomes and results. This is the part of the leadership model that we labeled purpose. Number 2, define behaviors that will generate the desired performance. This represents the process portion of the leadership model. And number 3, change rewards and punishments to align with desired behaviors. This corresponds to the passion part of the leadership model and is the one most closely connected to culture. When speaking of rewards and punishments, I'm not primarily talking about formal systems of compensation and correction, but rather the informal and often unrecognized ways in which we either positively or negatively affect people as a result of their actions. Consider the following scenario.
Hey Sarah, have you seen Jill?
No, I don't think she's here yet. She's probably late again.
Well, this needs to be done right away. Can you take care of it since Jill isn't here yet?
Yeah, I guess so.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
What are some of the rewards and punishments that occurred in this situation? Notice that Sarah is rewarded by being allowed to come in late and by receiving a lighter workload, while Jill is punished by being given extra work on top of her own in order to cover for Sarah. How long do you think it will take before Jill begins to reason, what's the use of being diligent and working hard when I'm treated the same as others that don't? This type scenario happens far more frequently than you might think. Unless the system of rewards and punishments changes, people won't. Remember, people don't change because they see the light, they change because they feel the heat. In other words, change is driven not just by rational choices, but by emotion or passion that makes the choice either appealing or, as the case may be, appalling. Here's one of my favorite photos, and I think it's a great illustration regarding the effect of culture or an environment on performance. The first thing that usually jumps out at people when they see this picture is, wow, what a brave cat. However, after another moment's thought, what is even more impressive is, wow, what disciplined dogs. Imagine if just one of those dogs decided to ignore its training and exhibit the behavior of doing what is only natural for a dog to do, chase the cat. What do you think the effect on the rest of the group would be? What if it were the alpha or lead dog that decided to chase the cat? The effect would be even more dramatic and immediate, and of course the result would probably be the need to look for a new cat. These dogs display a different type of assumption at work. Rather than the expected cats are for chasing assumption, they exhibit a handlers are to be obeyed assumption that results in a very different behavior, and thankfully for the cat, a very different result. By establishing a results-based model of leadership development in your practice, and consistently rewarding those who practice it with greater freedom, responsibility, and decision-making opportunities, you too can create a constructive culture that has your team performing as impressively as the dogs in our photo. Thank you for investing your valuable time with us in this video series on leadership development. And on behalf of all of us here at Animal Care Technologies, I wish you all the best in your continued personal and professional development.